So up next, we have 4 panelists. I'll call them up. And Channing Arndt is Director of Environment and Production Technology Division at IFPRI. Professor Mahendra Dev, Director and Vice Chancellor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in India. We have Professor Joyce Kanabo. She is the President of the Federation of African Nutrition Societies in Tanzania and also a professor at a University of Agriculture in Tanzania. And Ian Wright, who is Deputy Director General at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. We are going to start with some opening remarks. Channing, you're up first. Yes.
All right.
And if you can just swap out your name tags.
I did that.
Okay, great. I can take Michael's. Okay, perfect.
Okay, I'm going to sort of compliment Jessica and talk about Africa. And the marginal increases that what's going on. There's going to be a lot of action happening in Africa over the coming 30 years. So on the demand side, we're looking at about 50% of the population growth that we're expecting to 2050 happening in Africa. In addition, we continue to expect income growth in Africa. So by the time we get to 2050, nearly the entire continent will be at least lower middle income. Many in higher income and upper middle income categories. So this involves both an increase in the total amount of calories that they'll consume, as well as the kind of dietary shifts that Jessica was talking about having happened in Asia, pushing into Africa. So we're looking at a great deal of demand, and whether that demand sort of spills over and puts more pressure on developed country or existing systems outside of Africa, or whether it's met within Africa, is a real set of issues. I think it's relatively well known that Africa has quite good supply potential. Current yields are way below potential yields. There's quite a lot of land that's not exploited. That has environmental cost to it, but it's there. And there's only a small area that's been exploited for irrigation. So that possibility is known. I think that less well, it was certainly, I didn't know until I looked most recently, is that Africa's been quite dynamic in agriculture in the past 10 years. So cereal yields in Africa have grown the fastest of any continent, actually by a considerable margin. Area expansion has also been the fastest in cereals of any continent. So production growth in Africa has been pretty much by far the fastest. We're also seeing labor-intensive crops move into Africa on small scales. So, for example, production of sesame seed is moving out of Asia, moving out of Latin America, and into Africa. So, if we look forward and we do this at IFPRI, looking at a dynamic future, we're looking at getting some things that we don't necessarily all want. We have a moderately optimistic scenario, but it's still yielding us a fair amount of area expansion. Most of the gains are coming from yield, but we're still getting a fair amount of area expansion with environmental impacts. We get, again, not huge, but reasonable size net import increase. So, for example, we're looking at, in 2050, net maize imports into the continent that are about 5% of total maize supply today. So not huge, but something that would produce some pressure. And importantly, that reference scenario is not reducing the absolute size of the population vulnerable to hunger. So we need to do better. And I was surprised, what I had written up was a lot of what Prabhu was talking about. So I highlight some, like he did, the ICT, and remote sensing capabilities, our ability to get information to farmers as one thing, as an accelerator. The leapfrogging issue, particularly in infrastructure and particularly in rural electrification, the opportunities are enormous with distributed solar and its low cost. An area that he didn't mention is bioinnovation. And here I think we want to take from what Maximo was talking about in terms of especially getting Ministry of Plan and Finance involved in a strategy for using bioinnovation and getting it used properly, because it is an intersectoral phenomenon and it needs an intersectoral approach, and that's what that group is meant to do. So those were the comments that I wanted to make.